everyone. I am Angela Angelovska-Wilson. I am a co-founder of DLx Law and Sept, which is a fintech company. I have been in the space for a very long time, especially in crypto years. And DLx is a law firm that specializes in blockchain and anything really related to crypto. We made a very conscious choice about being able to specialize in crypto, and the reason for DLx and my co-founder Louis was on the previous panel is we both came out of big law, and we felt that really being able to serve this ecosystem, we really needed to have a specialized firm that really got its hands dirty and understood the technology and some of the challenges and opportunities that it brings for new business models, new markets, new everything, all the things that all of us that are here are excited about. And so when we kind of look at the development of technology over, history, we always see kind of that the economy that develops, right? The technology moves and markets move things forward, and they move them very, very quickly. And then, the law and the regulation kind of comes through. This is obviously not a surprise. It's just exactly the same thing that's happening in crypto and blockchain. I said I did work in this space back in 2013, 2014, and I would speak to some of my friends in Washington that were regulators, and I would say, like, can you get some clarity on, like, Bitcoin? Can you get anything? And a very wise senior person once told me, they're like, it's a pimple. It has really not that big of an effect, and if we actually acknowledge it exists, we are going to give it, credibility. So we're just going to see and watch what happens. Fast forward a number of years, they have stopped just watching and are actively trying to, implement and do a lot of different regulations. So, which is really where the title of my speech comes from. I feel that just about every day that what regulators around the globe are doing when it comes to the blockchain, the crypto space, is they're just throwing the book. And there's thousands of laws, there's thousands of different implementations, thousands of different, ways that the regulator can take a look at some of the things that are going on in the blockchain space and find an applicable law or an interpretation that, propels their view of what the regulation should be. So, as I was saying, there is a lot going on right now, and it's happening, both in the United States. We have seen the federal regulators take a very keen eye to what's happening in the crypto space. And the same is true with respect to other jurisdictions on a global scale. There is an avalanche of new regulations, studies, recommendations. Every day, I can't keep up, and I don't think anyone can keep up with the volume of things that are just coming through. And the most interesting thing for me is to see kind of the evolution about the thinking of the regulatory frameworks that are kind of applicable to the space. And, here we see the regulators around the world take very different approaches. On one side, we have regulators that look at it and they say, that's it, we're just going to outright ban it. We are not going to allow any crypto, it's banned, right? And then you have, others that are saying our existing laws, the United States SEC being one of them, our existing laws are sufficient and applicable. That's what Gary Gensler's, speeches have been like. We have the tools, we have the laws, we have the regulations that we need to address all the different issues that are coming through. And then, you have regulators like in Wyoming and in other parts of the world that are looking at it and they're saying, like, our laws and our regulations are good, but they're not really applicable. They're not suited for the purposes of the things that are happening in this space, in the blockchain space, and they're not suitable to really harness the power of the innovation and what this can do, this technology can do in a transformative way, as we develop further the ecosystem. As I was saying, one of the biggest issues that we see regulators and people think about is there's one issue typically that a law or regulation or guidance is trying to address. So when it comes to the crypto space, like in many other areas, we have a patchwork of different rules that apply to a different aspects. So you have your AML laws that are applying and trying to, put forward the principles of like anti-money laundering and all the things that are good. We want, a crime not to be using the crypto space. But, it also is not sufficient to just say, okay, just AML, that's it, it needs to work with like, how does that work with securities laws? How does that work with the derivatives laws? How does that work with consumer protection, tax, all these different things? There's really not a harmonized view from regulators on, having a comprehensive regulatory framework that is applicable to the space. So, some regulators are trying to do this. And again, I think, I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. In Wyoming is taking a very wholesale view and to say a picture of it and saying like, okay, what are the things that we're missing? How can we make a framework that addresses holistically a number of different issues that are in this space instead of doing this patchwork that I was talking about? So the Europeans are trying to do something similar to that, where they want to have a very consistent regulatory frameworks across Europe, and they want to have a consistent framework that addresses the various aspects of the technology and crypto assets, not just exchanges and trading, which is what the UK is doing. In the UK, they are looking at the European laws. They have implemented some of the money laundering directives on a national level, and now they're also looking at like the trading businesses. But there is a gap in that framework on all the other activities that is happening in the space. So my favorite thing is that when people talk about blockchain regulation, is that it inevitably goes down to a comparison to the regulatory frameworks that we have or did not have, and the discussions we talked about when we started to regulate the internet. So I have a view that the parallels to internet regulation are not exactly the right parallel to look at when we think about regulation and legal principles in the blockchain space. And the reason for that is that while they start kind of from the same point of view, which is, no government interference, free flow. One is of data, one is of assets, peer-to-peer transactions, the underlying policy with respect to each are very different. So, when we talk about internet regulation, it really is about data. It's about communication and it's about the flow of data, which in most of the time and in most jurisdictions is not something that is regulated on a very in a very defined way. It's more about free flow of information, free flow of data, and traditionally this is not like a core regulatory framework. When it comes to finance, I have not come across a jurisdiction that does not have a laws that address the financial system in that jurisdiction. So, who can do what with money has always been regulated. And it is naive to think that this type of regulation should not be applicable to the next, evolution of money. So, and at its core, when we talk about financial regulation, every country, every government has, and I'm going to suppose citizens also have an interest in financial and economic stability, consumer protection, and preventing financial crime. I think most of us all around the world can kind of agree that these are good principles to put in. However, to date, the financial regulators have really moved very slowly to engage and understand the technical changes that are happening, the evolution that is happening in the blockchain and crypto space in order to be able to look at these principles, with a new set of lenses. They're looking at them with the same set of lenses that exist there for central parties. And again, doing the compare and contrast with internet regulation, the way that the regulators solve that one, solved in big quotes, is by imposing regulation on the central parties. So the PSPs, the telephone providers, that's where the regulation came in. And in the blockchain space, that's really not possible anymore. Like we can't use the same principle for what we have today. So, financial regulation is at its essence a legal construct, and it's a very complex one. And so, I do not want to sound like the regulators have no clue what they're doing. They really do. The problem is this is a very complex issue. And they know that, if they push on one side of the balloon, it's going to come out on the other. And so that's why I think like a comprehensive view and a comprehensive, framework that addresses the various concerns of various regulatory frameworks, right? Consumer protection with respect to security sales, right? Like that's a great principle. How does that work with the principle of like financing terrorism, right? Let's get it all together. So with tax payments, we just can't have a patchwork. So, obviously we need a legal innovation and regulatory innovation. So the premise of my here is that people look at technical innovation as the driving force of actually innovation and change in society. So I'm going to try to challenge that since I am a lawyer and say, the techies can't get all the credit. So when we really think about some of the different points in time in history, and you think about, the technical innovation or mechanical innovation that was taking place, we do see instances where, the law was catching up to it. But, in the 19th century, and I've done a lot of research and studying on this to really come up with this kind of premise, is in the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution is a point in time where we are all looking at and saying, the Industrial Revolution changed everything. And most of the time that gets reported as, we put machines in and, what were back then, manual processes became, mechanical or industrial processes. However, I am going to challenge that and say, I actually think that the most significant innovation during the Industrial Revolution was actually the a legal innovation, which was the birth of a corporation. Because without the corporation, there would have never been the ability to scale and never had the ability to get to the point of where the Industrial Revolution could actually take off. So there are, back then, most businesses were run by families, very small partnerships, very small, entities. And there was really no ability other than if you had benefactors that believed in whatever you were saying you could actually come up with as your innovation to put into the market that, funded. There were no VC firms, no hedge funds out there. And it was very difficult for anyone to actually obtain the capital and to be able to, in order to be able to scale. So this was addressed, I think, through the legal means by, using the modern limited liability joint stock company as a legal institution. And, today, I think we look at the corporation and this legal constructs that exists out there as a given. Like, none of us think about the fact that, this was really a challenging concept back in the 19th century. You were going to have somebody that wasn't a person, that was going to take all the money, and everybody was going to have a little bit of an interest in it, and then they were going to do the right thing in order for you to make money. Sounds like few things that are happening in our space these days. So in the 19th century, people were like, I don't know, I'm going to have a CEO and a board of directors, and I don't know them and I don't control it, and I'm going to give them a capital. So there were a lot of legal issues that were coming through about, legalizing, personalizing, making the corporation be a person, right? Like, when we think about it at its core level, we gave personhood to the corporation through legal means in order to be able to get the regulatory frameworks that existed at that time to be established and then to develop as the years came by. And again, I'm going to say that it is the ability to have a corporation that actually propelled the Industrial Revolution, because they could scale. A lot of entities, were now able to spend money, time, resources in research and development, and they were able to really establish markets and conquer markets. So, sorry, I should have probably, fast forwarded through my slides here. We are again at those crossroads. But this time around, it's the technical innovation that is kind of propelling us to think about the legal and regulatory frameworks that we need in order to have the next industrial revolution. When I say that regulatory innovation is not an oxymoron, I really, really mean it. I think, we as lawyers and regulators and participants in the space do have an obligation to engage in a meaningful discussion about what are some of the regulatory principles, what are some of the regulatory frameworks that ought to be applicable to the space. The speed of technological development, the global interconnectedness, and the legacy risks are definitely something that needs to be addressed in the blockchain space, immediately. One of the other things that we are seeing, just like in the 19th century, there was a challenge of how to think about a corporation. We are now seeing the challenge of how do we have a global regulatory framework, right? So far, all of our regulations are very local. But, crypto and blockchain is global. It is very difficult because of the underlying nature of it, for somebody to say, well, that transaction on Ethereum took place in jurisdiction X. How? And so what law applies, what regulatory framework applies is really challenged by the technology. Which is why I think that a global regulatory frameworks and principles are really necessary. I also think that too much regulation is never a good thing. So it does really need to be outcome focused, and it has to be flexible, and it has to follow the exponential growth of tech through continuous improvement. So one of the examples that I like, and thankfully that's why we're all here in Wyoming, is the legal innovations that Wyoming passed. So most of you are probably familiar with some of the legislative efforts in Wyoming to really address the gaps that existed in existing laws. And regulations, as well as to kind of comprehensively look at the space and to say, what are the things that are, issues, what are the things that are blockers, what are the things that, need more clarity, and how can we give clarity without really killing innovation? I think that's the key that we as lawyers always really need to think about. It's really, really easy to be the department of no, right? As a lawyer. So, somebody comes in and can we do this? No. It's always safer to say no than to say yes. The question always, in my mind, we as lawyers have to think about is, what is it that fundamentally, what are the fundamental issues that will arise from whatever is the business proposition that we are doing? And what are those core principles that as a society we have agreed are good and should be implemented on a large scale? So nobody wants the financing of terrorism. I'm going to say exactly. They kind of would prefer a much easier access to the financial rails. But, most of us would say that's a principle we don't really want to have. And so when you think about like, how can the thing that I'm building and the transactions that are going through keep that principle of like, I don't want terrorists to use my project, my token, my, anything, right? Like my business in order to finance terrorism, because I actually think that that's not a good thing. And so what are some of those principles that you can actually put in order to do it? I think that's, what Wyoming did with, most recently with one of the Dow bills. Again, I think there's a lot of parallels when I saw some of the Dow discussions, that if you look at some of the 19th century issues of what people were saying about corporations, I think you'll see a lot of parallels. It's kind of interesting to see it. I'm breezing through here, so you guys are going to have to ask me questions. Usually I'm running late on my so I think one of the most important principles for legal innovation is, I think I agree with Andy Graham, who's the CEO of Intel, co-founder of Intel, that technology will always delay technology by legal interference, but technology will flow around legal barriers. And I think that's one of the things that we as lawyers, especially practicing in this space, we have a duty to really address how can the legal and regulatory frameworks existing in you allow technology to really flow, not around, but together and really propel innovation in the space. All right, I'm going to ask questions. I can keep going on all of this, but yes.
So I guess I have this question for you. The points you make are great ones. And I really like the 19th century analogy. I think it's actually spot on. But one of the things that is clearly part of the dialogue today is the political agendas that the elected officials in Washington have. And the regulators are going to tend to follow what the elected officials are signaling because that's where they get their appropriations. Clearly, there's an effort to create a climate of fear around cryptocurrencies, decentralized finance, etc. And while the legal principles that you're articulating, it'd be difficult to disagree with them, but they're almost antiseptic compared to the political climate and political currents. So how do you deal with those two sort of separate rails? The legal theory, which everyone I think in this room can agree with, but the cross-cutting political currents.
That's always the hard one, right? Because many things and many laws that start out as a great principles that everyone can agree to, by the time it's written and passed into law, it's been bastardized quite a bit because of the different interests that come into the legal legislative process, right? Amendments, all kinds of things. And, again, that's not something new. It has always been that way. There are, I like to say that there are certain things that, get passed into a law and they are irrelevant at the moment they're passed, because they're not connected to the reality in which something operates. So, when we think about regulators today, thinking about how they can stop DeFi, I try to explain to them that it's going to be really, really, really difficult. It's just not going to work. And there are certain things that even if the regulation passes, it will make it very difficult for the implementation and for the people that actually do care to be compliant and have a legally sound, principled operations, but the tech is going to go around. So, in my mind, for regulators and legislators, I always say, you have to ground your laws and regulations and principles And otherwise, they're meaningless and nobody's going to follow them and they're not going to do any good and you're going to have to repeal them, pretty soon. I mean, I did a lot of work during the financial crisis in 2008 on Dodd-Frank. And I used to joke that, I was going to spend 10 years of my career implementing it. And then the next 10 years, unwinding everything that was in there, because they would realize that these things do not work on a practical level. So as an example from 2008, the Volcker rule. Everyone loved it. It passed. They put it in and then they repealed it. Changed it. Because it wasn't going to work right. So, anyone else?
So my understanding is that the first corporation was the East India Company. And you're placing your time frame a little bit later. Was that like a legal debate over personhood that you're hoping to?
Yeah, I mean, it's, I'm placing it a little bit later because it's the acceptance of the concept. So when the East India Company came, to be, that concept was not very widely accepted. And you can also read a lot of the discussions that happened about how this should not be, right? A lot of pushback. So, it took a little bit of time for people to get comfortable with the whole idea of what a corporation is and to treat it as a person, as an individual.
Do you know when states started passing their own corporation laws? Is that kind of time frame?
It's about that time frame. I actually have have a law review article in the making on this, but with citations, but haven't had time to actually write on it because I do think that the legal innovation does not get enough credit for how instrumental it is in order for technology to actually take off. Yes.
Sort of at the intersection of the technology and then your legal work, what's the one thing that not keeps you up at night worrying, but that you're most fascinated by? Like what's next that you're really focused on?
Well, there's just so much going on in this space. I get really excited about any of the protocols, layer 1, layer 2, that are actually solving some of the issues that we're seeing in the space. So I'm old enough where, people said that the internet wasn't going to be really usable because, you just couldn't have enough data. And the speed was not just there. I mean, there was no way you were going to have Netflix, back in 1998. Even if as a visionary you could see it coming, the technology was not there. So what I really, really enjoy is learning about the technical teams that are solving some of the problems in the space, with technical solutions. So, for example, my partner Louis earlier talked about one of the big issues in NFTs is the, persistence of the data. And, I love learning about all the different protocols that are solving that issue in different ways, right? So there's so much intellectual curiosity and innovation that is happening in solving some of the problems, like how do you scale blockchain, right? Like another one where, people kept saying back in the day, like, well, Bitcoin can't scale. The transactions are not going to be fast enough. And, it's kind of funny when you look at some of the scripts, of like some of the things that people have always said about technology. It can't do X. And then, people work on X and then they get it. From a legal perspective, what I really worry about are some of the regulations that are not grounded in reality and are very onerous, especially in the United States. I think that we do have a risk of a lot of good, innovative projects, and we have seen this move away from the US, and I think that it gets us to be, at a disadvantage. I'll give you an example. There's a lot of discussion about stablecoins and how stablecoins, the regulators, it's the topic du jour that the regulators in Washington do not have, right? It's stablecoins because it has all kinds of monetary policy implications. Rightfully so, they should be looking at it, no question about it. But they're only looking at it from the problem. What they're not looking at it is that, all the stable coins have dollarized the entire crypto economy. The entire crypto economy runs on the dollar. It does not run on the yuan. It does not run on the euro. So if you think about it from that perspective, you've just dollarized a whole new space, a whole new market that is running on the dollar. And this is bad how? So, when you look at it, they want to regulate stable coins, and what's going to happen is someone else is going to come in, and it's no longer the dominant stable coin is not going to be dollarized. It's going to be, EU or yuan or something else, because people are going to go wherever is the least amount of friction. And that's kind of my point. It's like that's what worries me, is that there's a tunnel vision of like, we're only looking at the problem over here, but we're not looking at the opportunity when we're passing the laws and the regulations. Any other questions? So be active. I think, yes, please.
Yeah, well, I'm actually I think you're gonna say something similar to this. So what recommendations do you have about how to get involved in a productive way? It's difficult to lobby the regulators. There is a financial innovation caucus in the Senate. Senator Lamas is from Wyoming, is one of the co-chairs. What recommendations do you have about how to get involved?
Honestly, I think the best thing that anyone can do is actually, be active in educating everyone around them about what actually crypto is and what it is not. There are so many narratives out there that are, crypto is only used for crime. There is, I always say, like, if I was a dumb money launderer, I would use crypto to cancel lunch. If I was a smart one, there's, a lot of misinformation. And I think that, every single person that actually understands, the pluses and the minuses of this tech can really propel things forward, because we're all connected. And the legislators and the regulators live among us, right? Like my kids go to school with a lot of regulators, and when they come to talk to me about it, I try to give them parallels, things that they understand, principles that they can actually implement and not be left out. But most importantly, what I think everybody thirsts for is really an understanding and knowledge. And I think when people actually understand and they get the knowledge, things go a little bit easier. I'll quote one of my favorite Broadway musicals, Avenue Q. They have a song, and the show takes place in the early days of the internet. And one of the theme songs is, "The internet is for porn," because that was the narrative. that nobody can use the internet for anything commercial. The internet is for porn. Like that was the entire narrative. And, fast forward 20 years later, none of those senators, legislators, regulators are saying, the internet has no commercial value and can only be used for porn. So I would also encourage everybody to be involved in various trade organization representations, basically anything where you can influence and provide, again, that core-based knowledge to really help people understand, like, I'm not just saying this, and connected to the real world, right? Like, if we're talking about how, Bitcoin is so terrible for the environment, right? There is a question that happens, which is, how much power does JP Morgan Chase use in order the Visa network?
More than Bitcoin.
Well, we don't know. It's not transparent. So just because something is not transparent, just because something is transparent doesn't mean that that's the bad thing. You have to compare apples to apples. And because the Visa network, energy powers are not transparent, no one is pointing, the finger and saying credit card networks are not, are terrible for the environment. I can guarantee you the JP Morgan Chase's, data centers are probably using a huge amount of energy, but nobody knows how much. And so, again, connected to what people know and understand. And then, it makes the discussion a lot easier so that it's not everybody digs their heels in and says, like, bad for the environment, good for the environment. Like, there's a discussion point that happens, and again, this is work scaled over 40 years. So I would expect it to have a much better energy use, efficient use than something that is 10 years old. Any other questions? Almost done. No questions? Everybody's clear? Everybody's going to go lobby, write some laws, draft some regulations? Well, thank you very much. You guys have been great. And thank you, everyone who's on video. Hopefully, you've gotten a few things to think about as you go out and do your practice.